28 last time. We are now picking up in verse 29 of Exodus 12. The 10th plague is what is in store. All of the teaching up to this point from Exodus 12 has been getting ready for this day. And it says, at midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the livestock. Okay, that part of the latter half of verse 29 is simply describing the parameters of which this plague affected. It affected the highest in the land, Pharaoh's house. It affected the lowest in the land, the least of those that were imprisoned. It didn't just affect people. It affected their possessions, their livestock as well. And so listen to what it says in verse 30. Pharaoh rose up in the night. Pharaoh rose up in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where someone was not dead. I want you to think about that for a moment. How big of a deal is it for a family to lose a loved one? It's a big deal. Where does it usually happen in our time? You ever thought about that? Where does the loss of our loved ones usually happen in our time? At a hospital. At maybe a nursing facility for some of them. If it's an unfortunate accident or something, that's usually on the road somewhere. What do very few of us ever have to deal with? A body in our house. Very few of us ever have to deal with a body in our house. Does that add to the stress of the situation if the body is in our house? Absolutely. That adds to the stress of the situation. What about if there's more than one body in my house? And what about, and by the way, what do we usually do when something traumatic happens in our house? We run to a friend or to a neighbor or maybe to a family member and say, hey, I need some help. I've got this situation. But understand that when they did that, guess what they found? Their friend or neighbor or family member had the same situation. The neighbor on the right, the neighbor on the left, the neighbor across the street, the neighbor behind you. Doesn't matter, every house you go to. What do you do with all of these? How do you handle this? Whatever infrastructure that society has in place to deal with their dead, it's overwhelmed. It is, but even a long time ago, what you have to understand is there were only a certain number of people that passed on any given day in an area, and people were able to call upon others for help and deal with what they needed to deal with and address the problem. The situation here is every single household in Egypt had at least one body. Imagine how overwhelming the situation is. And imagine the impression. Do you think these people ever forgot that night as long as they lived? We need to get that impression in our minds as well. We need to realize how many people are going to be eternally lost at the hand of God. This is an overwhelming thing. This is not some small. Now, all they had to do to avoid this is do what? Kill a lamb and put some blood on your house. And there's no problem. Those people, those slaves from Israel who followed God's command, guess what? These are the only people in the entire country that have no dead people to deal with. They're not dealing with death. They've been spared this plague. Don't you think that's noticed by the Egyptians? Yes, it is. And listen to what he does. They rose up in the night, he and all his servants, and the Egyptians. There was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where someone was not dead. Listen, the pandemic that we're going through right now is nothing compared to what happened that night in Egypt. Nothing. Not even a blip on the radar. He summoned Moses and Aaron by night. This doesn't even wait till morning. It's not like he says, well, okay, we're going to deal with this in the morning. No. Get Moses here now. This hour, I want to talk to Moses. He summoned Moses and Aaron by night and said, up, go from among my people. Both you and the people of Israel, go, serve the Lord as you have said. Take your flocks and your herds as you have said, and be gone and bless me also. Listen, it made an impression on Pharaoh, to the point that Pharaoh not only sends them away, but says, look, on your way out, offer a blessing for us. The Egyptians were urgent with the people to send them out of the land in haste, for they said, we shall all be dead. So the people took their dough before it was leavened, their kneading bowls being bound up in their cloaks on their shoulders. The people of Israel had also done as Moses told them. They had asked the Egyptians for silver and gold jewelry and for clothing. The Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they let them have what they asked. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. And the people of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. Probably in excess of 1 million people are now traveling by foot to leave Egypt. A mixed multitude also went up with them, and very much livestock, both flocks and herds. What is this mixed multitude that went up with them? Other people who chose to go with Israel rather than stay in Egypt. Understand the impact of these events, and understand that this is nothing but a shadow. This is not the substance. This is what God is doing, so we have some way of grasping and understanding the substance. Think about that, because it becomes important in a little while. They baked unleavened cakes of dough that they had brought out of Egypt, for it was not leavened, because there was thrust out of Egypt and could not wait, nor had they prepared any provision for themselves. The time that the people of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years. Now, this is the explanation of why the commandments pertaining to the observance of the Passover was not to involve leavened things. Why did they have unleavened bread after they were delivered? Because it was done in such haste that there wasn't any time for the dough to rise. Okay? And so the instruction, get the leaven out of your house and don't eat anything leavened for 7 days, was to remind them of the urgency with which these things came to pass. And remember that urgency, because that urgency should be connected to the substance that this shadow represents. If the shadow has urgency, then the substance all the more. At the end of 430 years, On that very day, all the host of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. It was a night of watching by the Lord to bring them out of the land of Egypt. So this same night is a night of watching kept to the Lord by all the people of Israel throughout their generations. A night of watching. A night of God's deliverance. For the Israelites, this is not a night of death and destruction, but a night of deliverance by God. A night of watching. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "This is the statute of the Passover. No foreigner shall eat of it, but every slave that is bought for money may eat of it after you have circumcised him." So you got to understand some things about the way their society functioned. This was something specifically for Israel. However, those that were a part of Israel, if they were circumcised and respected the covenant in all other respects, could participate. Certain things they couldn't do, but this they could. No foreigner or hired worker may eat of it. Someone who's not circumcised, someone who's not part of the covenant, someone who's not permanent, was to be excluded. It shall be eaten in one house. You shall not take any of the flesh outside the house. You shall not break any of its bones. All the congregation of Israel shall keep it. If a stranger shall sojourn with you and would keep the Passover of the Lord, let all his males be circumcised. If someone is passing through and wants to participate, that's fine, but they have to do what? They have to join the covenant. Circumcision was a sign of the covenant. It was a sign that you were engaged in this covenant with God. Then he may come near and keep it. He shall be as a native of the land, but no uncircumcised person shall eat of it. And so once someone was engaged in the covenant, it didn't matter where they were from, did it? Once they were part of the covenant of God, they were to be viewed as natives to Israel. There shall be one law for the native and for the stranger who sojourns among you. And so you don't say, well, this person doesn't know any better. No, there's one law. And it's to be enforced. All the people of Israel did just as the Lord commanded Moses and Aaron. And on that very day, the Lord brought the people of Israel out of the land of Egypt and their host. So what was a day of death and destruction for Egypt was actually a day of what? Deliverance and salvation for the people of God. And we got to keep that in our minds. That contrast. What made the difference between death and salvation? Whether or not you were in a covenant relationship with God. Whether or not you were obeying His commandments. If you did what He said and you were part of the covenant, it was a day of salvation. All right, any questions or comments about the Passover itself as it unfolded? And again, I want to stress, this cannot be stressed enough, everything we have read over the last 3 weeks from Exodus 12 is a discussion of the shadow, not the substance. These things were written for our learning, upon whom the end of the ages has come. Both in 1 Corinthians and Romans, both were told that the record of these events is for the benefit of those of us who live under Christ, who are a part of the new covenant. That these things were merely demonstrations of the greatness of what God was doing. Now, there are a lot of places that we can go. We're not going to look at everything that the New Testament can possibly say. We want to go first to Luke 22, the Gospel of Luke chapter 22, and read from here and hopefully discuss some things. What's going on here? Just to kind of set the stage. This is the end of Christ's life on the earth, or near the end of it, the process to carry out the plot against Jesus has begun. That plot, of course, is for his arrest and condemnation and ultimate execution. And so that has been hatched. It is starting to take place. And it's not by chance. The Bible makes it clear that everything that happened at the proper time. It's not by chance that this story begins with this statement. Now the feast of unleavened bread drew near. Why did God choose the feast of unleavened bread to be the time that these events would come to pass? It's pretty simple, because those events were the shadow of what God was accomplishing through Christ. We're supposed to connect death and destruction and a lamb and deliverance by blood all to these events. We're supposed to carry with us the urgency of that night into this discussion. And I think for far too many of us, we are comfortable. We are just comfortable thinking that we have time on our side. Every Egyptian went to bed that night thinking they had time on their side. And they woke up in the middle of the night completely unprepared for what they were seeing and what they were facing. The ones who had been forewarned by God and who had prepared by doing what he told them to do were spared that situation. That carries over to this discussion. If you listen to God, if you do what he says, if you're prepared, you're not caught by surprise. Was Jesus surprised by the events that were going to take place? Not in the least. He knew exactly what was coming to pass. He knew that it was time for it to come to pass. How did he know? Because he knew the plan of the Father. That urgency is there and should be felt by us. The feast of unleavened bread drew near, which is called the Passover, and the chief priests and the scribes were seeking how to put him to death, for they feared the people. Satan entered into Judas, called Iscariot, who was one of the members of the 12, and he went away and conferred with the chief priests and officers how he might betray them to him to them. They were glad and agreed to give him money. Now, I want to tell you, verse 5 certainly leaves the impression with me that the giving of money was Judas's idea. That Judas said, hey guys, y'all have to pay me for this. And it says they were glad and agreed to give him money. So he consented and sought an opportunity to betray him to them in the absence of a crowd. He was looking for a time and a place where there wasn't a whole lot of people, so this could go quiet and peaceful as much as possible. Then came the day of unleavened bread, on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. This timing is not by accident. It is the day of the Passover that these events unfold. The day of remembrance. The day, by the way, many generations later, the day when the next generation says to the older generation, what do these things mean? Why are we doing this? Well, let me tell you the story of why we're doing this. Long ago, in the days of Moses, the people were enslaved. And God promised to deliver them. And God told them that death would come upon them unless a lamb was sacrificed and the blood of the lamb was placed on the house. And around midnight, death came. And there were dead in every house in Israel. And the crying and lamentation were great. But our ancestors were spared because of the blood of the Lamb. And God commanded that we observe this feast annually so that we might never forget God's deliverance through blood. And so we might have opportunity to share with you a recounting of the deliverance of God from death through blood. That day, when that was going on, this is what was happening. Came the day of unleavened bread on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. Jesus sent to Peter and John saying, "Go, prepare the Passover for us that we may eat it." They said to him, "Where will you have us prepare it?" And he said to them, "Behold, when you have entered the city, a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him into the house that he enters, and tell the master of the house, the teacher says to you, where is the guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples?" Now, we've talked about this somewhat recently, I think, in a Sunday sermon. This guest room apparently became a common feature of the Jewish home with at least the people who had the means to do it, which was kept prepared so that they could show hospitality. And so that's what Jesus is telling them. You follow this person with this jar of water, you go to the house, you find the master of the house, and you say, "We need your hospitality." Which, of course, they were commanded by God to give. And so, this is the room that Jesus is going to use to observe this feast in remembrance of God's deliverance in the Passover. He will show you a large upper room furnished. Prepare it there. Verse 13. They went and found it just as he told them, and they prepared the Passover. Here's the setting. This is what's going on. And when the hour came, what hour is that? The hour to observe the Passover. It was to be done at twilight. The lamb was to be killed. Everything was to be prepared and then eaten. When the hour came, he reclined at table, and the apostles with him, and he said to them, "I have earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer." Notice that this is something that Christ has been looking forward to. I have been earnestly desiring this particular Passover with you. This one before I suffer. I wanted to be here. I've been looking forward to being here on this day, at this time, doing these things with you. For I tell you, I will not eat it until it is fulfilled in the kingdom of God. In other words, this is the last Passover before everything's fulfilled. So he's telling them what? Fulfilled is not an accidental word. What does fulfillment mean? To complete, to carry out, to bring to fruition. And so when we're talking about reading about the shadow of something which is to come, and he says what's about to happen is the fulfillment of all of this, we need to understand that the events that follow are the substance. of what the Passover was intended to be merely a shadow of. He took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he said, "Take this and divide it amongst yourselves. For I tell you that from now on I will not drink of the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes." And he took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to them, saying, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." The setting of this is the eating of a Passover meal to remember God's deliverance through blood by a sacrifice of a Passover lamb. And Jesus takes a piece of bread and says, "Eat this. This is my body, which is given for you." He is making application of the Passover. The Passover was the shadow. Christ is saying, "I am the fulfillment." The Passover lamb was slain, and the blood was provided to the people to avoid death. Jesus was soon to die, and his blood would be offered to avoid our separation from God, to make it possible for us to be reconciled to God, to make it possible for us to avoid the second death. "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." The Passover meal was a remembrance. The observance of this that Jesus is now instituting is to be a remembrance. Likewise, the cup after they had eaten, saying, "This cup is poured out for you. Poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood." Not the blood of a lamb, but my blood. This is a new covenant, a new promise that is based on my blood being spilled rather than the blood of a spotless lamb. "Behold, the hand of him who betrays me is with me on the table. For the Son of Man goes as it has been determined, but woe to that man by whom he is betrayed. One of you here is my betrayer." They began to question one another which of them it could be who was going to do this. Why? Why did Jesus institute the memorial of his sacrifice in the middle of the Passover feast? Because the events of Jesus going to the cross were the fulfillment of the Passover. It was why God did the Passover in the first place. Was God required to deliver the Israelites the way that he delivered them? No. So you got to understand, he did it the way he did it for a purpose, for a reason, to instruct, to help us understand, to foreshadow something that would be happening that we would otherwise have no other way to appreciate or understand. How great was the death in Egypt? How much greater the death apart from Christ? How many people died in Egypt? How many more people die apart from Christ? How terrible all of those deaths. How much worse all those who face eternal destruction apart from God. How great God's deliverance. How valuable. How urgent. How necessary the preparations. How necessary the obedience to the commands. How much more the value of the deliverance through Jesus. The value of the blood shed on the cross. value in doing all that God has commanded. Did anyone in Egypt get delivered without killing a lamb and putting the blood on their doorposts? Not a soul. Do we really believe that anyone's going to get deliverance from God apart from doing what He has instructed us to do in order to apply the blood of Christ? We shouldn't. We should understand that for every house, every single house in Egypt that didn't have the blood applied, they came face to face with death. Therefore, for everyone who doesn't have the blood of Christ applied, they come face to face with death. All of that urgency, all of the necessary preparation, all of the readiness is even more so in Jesus. He institutes the remembrance of His sacrifice because it is the substance of what they had remembered for all of those years. Deliverance by God through blood from death. Jesus said, I've been waiting for this day because this marks the fulfillment of the Passover. This is what it was really all about. Look over at 1 Corinthians chapter 5. I have on the slide that we're going to cover verses 1 through 8. We may stop there. We may read a few more. I don't know. It's a relatively short chapter. It's important to set the stage. This is a congregation of the Lord's people in the city of Corinth. This congregation of the Lord's people had some issues. They were not all living like they ought to live. They were not all practicing faith the way they ought to practice it. They didn't all completely grasp and understand the relationships, the importance of Jesus. There was divisions among the church there because they wanted to be associated with other people. I am of Paul, I am of Apollos, I am of Cephas. Paul says, none of us were crucified for you. This is about Jesus. Among the things that was going on in the church there was a man who we learn was engaged in sexual immorality. And the church was doing nothing to try to prevent that, to try to teach this person that they should cease and desist. It's actually reported that there is sexual immorality among you, and of a kind that is not tolerated even among pagans. For a man has his father's wife. It doesn't say a man has his mother. It says a man has his father's wife. I think it's fairly safe to conclude from that this is a stepmother, is what we would call her in our vernacular. I don't know what happened to his mother, but apparently his father had married someone else. But now, this man is engaged in sexual immorality with this woman who's married to his father. And he says the pagans wouldn't even tolerate this kind of nonsense. And you're arrogant. Ought you not rather to mourn? Let him who has done this be removed from among you. For though absent in body, I am present in spirit, and as if present, I have already pronounced judgment on the one who did such a thing. When you are assembled in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, and my spirit is present with you, the power of the Lord Jesus, you are to deliver this man to Satan for the destruction of the flesh, so that his spirit may be saved in the day of the Lord. Your boasting is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? Cleanse out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, as you really are unleavened. For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. Let us therefore celebrate the festival. What festival? In the context, he's referencing the Passover, the unleavened week in which they observed and remembered the sacrifice and deliverance by blood, where they went an entire week touching nothing that was leavened. In fact, what were they required to do? To go through their houses and prepare for this week by doing what? Removing all leaven from their home. They couldn't even have it in the house for an entire week. They removed leaven. Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. Let us therefore celebrate the festival not with the old leaven, the leaven of malice and evil, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. And so those things that God did with them about the leaven back there in the Passover, and that they observed for year after year after year after year, for generation after generation after generation, was supposed to teach the people of God that we're to be different when we're under the covenant of Christ. That we're to be cleansed. That sin and immorality is not to be associated with us. That the old leaven is to be removed out of the house. And that we instead should live by the unleavened life of sincerity and truth. I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people, not at all meaning the sexually immoral of this world, or the greedy, or the swindlers, or the idolaters, since you would need to go out of the world. When I wrote to you about not associating with these things, obviously, you can't exist in this world without running into people who do these things. That's not what I was talking to you about. I'm writing you not to associate with anyone who bears the name of a brother, a so-called Christian, if he's guilty of sexual immorality, or greed, or idolatry, or reveler, or drunkenness, or swindler, not even to eat with such a one. For what have I to do with judging outsiders? Is it not those inside the church whom you are to judge? God judges those outside. Purge the evil person from among you. Immorality, ungodliness, those kind of behaviors are like the leaven of the Passover. It's not to be left in the house. It's not to be tolerated. It's to be removed. There's teaching that's going on through these things. If Christ is our Passover, then we leave those things behind just like the Israelites left Egypt behind. And we become unleavened people, not mixed with the ungodliness and unrighteousness of the world, but rather having the unleavened life of sincerity and truth. Any questions about that? We'll wrap up this discussion next time, Lord willing. I may pull one other text in to kind of tie this up in a bow if I can. I appreciate your presence. I appreciate those that have watched online. And I'll try to remember to do this next hour as well. But for the benefit of those watching on Facebook, if you're having trouble with the audio, my experience is the audio on YouTube is a little bit better. It doesn't seem to be a problem on this end. It seems to be a problem on Facebook's end. So if you're having trouble with the audio, join us on